May 14th, 1943. 0547 hours. Monte Cassino sector, Italy. Asterisk Private First Class Emil Kowalczyk pressed his spine against the crater wall, dirt crumbling into his collar, breath shallow and silent. 200 meters upslope, hidden somewhere in the stone ruins and morning shadows, a German sniper had just killed his third man in 12 minutes. Kowalczyk couldn't see him, couldn't hear him, but he could feel the geometry of death tightening around his squad like a noose. The sun was rising fast behind the Allied line, casting long golden beams across the broken hillside, and Kowalczyk's hand drifted to the entrenching tool strapped to his pack. Not to dig, not to fight, but to reflect. Because 3 days ago, during a Boer afternoon behind the line, he discovered something no manual taught and no officer believed, that a polished shovel edge, angled just right in direct sunlight, could throw a blade of light so bright and focus it turned enemy optics into white-hot blindness. They'd laughed at him, called it a stupid trick, a waste of time. But now, with his squad pinned and dying, Kowalczyk unstrapped the shovel, tilted the blade toward the sun, and prepared to prove them all wrong. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. Asterisk. Emil Kowalczyk was 22 years old, born in a Pennsylvania coal town, where the only things more abundant than dust were fathers who never came home from the mines. His own father had died in a collapse when Emil was 9, buried under 2,000 tons of anthracite, and from that day forward, Emil developed an obsession with angles, leverage, and light. Not in any academic sense. He never finished high school, but in the practical, survival-driven way that poor boys learn when they have to make tools last, make food stretch, make pennies count. He learned that a wedge placed right could split a log a grown man couldn't break, that a mirror angled at sunrise could wake his younger brother without shouting, that geometry wasn't something you studied in books. It was something you lived. When he enlisted in 1942, he brought that mindset with him, a quiet, unorthodox problem-solving instinct that baffled his sergeants and irritated his officers. He didn't follow doctrine blindly. He tested it, bent it, looked for the edges where standard procedure stopped and improvisation began. And nowhere was that instinct more dangerous, more necessary, than on the killing fields of Italy, where the Wehrmacht had turned every ridgeline into a fortress and every shadow into a grave. The 34th Infantry Division had been grinding through the Italian mountains since January, fighting for every meter of mud and stone against an enemy that knew the terrain, controlled the high ground, and had no intention of giving it up. Cassino was a gateway to Rome, and the Germans had fortified it like a medieval siege, using the ancient monastery on the hilltop as an observation post and the rocky slopes below as interlocking fields of fire. American casualties were brutal. Companies went up the hill at full strength and came back at half. Platoons vanished into ravines and never reported in. And snipers, German snipers with Kar 98K rifles and Zeiscopes, turned daylight movement into suicide. They fired from concealed positions, often hundreds of meters away, picking off officers, radio men, medics, anyone whose death would cripple a unit. Standard countermeasures were slow and expensive. Call in artillery, hope you hit the right grid square, hope the sniper didn't just move, or send a scout forward with binoculars, hope he spotted the muzzle flash, hope he lived long enough to report. Neither option worked when you were pinned in a crater with no radio and 3 men already dead. Kowalczyk had been thinking about the sunlight problem for weeks. Not because he was trained in optics or ballistics, but because he'd noticed something during morning patrols. German snipers, like all snipers, used scope rifles. And scopes, no matter how well built, were just glass lenses that gathered and focused light, which meant they had a weakness. If you could throw a concentrated beam of light directly into the scope's objective lens, you could overwhelm the sniper's vision, flood his sight picture with white glare, force him to flinch, blink, move. It wasn't a kill shot. It was a disruption, a moment of blindness. But in combat, a moment was all you needed. The problem was generating that beam. A signal mirror worked, but was small, handheld, required steady aim, and wasn't something infantry carried on patrol. Kowalczyk needed something bigger, something every soldier had, something that could throw a wide, bright reflection over distance. And then One afternoon, while cleaning his entrenching tool, he saw it. The blade's steel edge, worn smooth by months of digging, had a faint mirror finish where the coating had rubbed away. He tilted it toward the sun. A sharp line of light shot across the tent wall, bright and focused, like a sword cut made of pure glare. He adjusted the angle. The line moved. He adjusted again. The line steadied, sharp as a knife. And Kowalczyk realized this would work. He tested it the next morning, before dawn broke, while the rest of the squad slept. He positioned himself on a low ridge, entrenching tool in hand, and waited for sunrise. As the first golden rays crested the eastern hills, he angled the shovel blade, turning it slowly until a reflected beam aligned with a distant rock outcrop 200 meters away. The effect was immediate and startling. A brilliant, almost painful streak of light, as focused as a spotlight, hitting the rock with enough intensity to make the surface shimmer. He held it steady for 10 seconds. 20, 30. Then he shifted the angle and swept the beam across the hillside, watching the light cut through shadows and bounce off stone. It worked. It absolutely worked. But when he brought the idea to his squad leader, Staff Sergeant Kowalczyk's enthusiasm hit a wall of skepticism. The sergeant, a career man named Harlan Voss, stared at him like he'd suggested using a slingshot against a tank. "You want to blind a sniper," Voss said slowly. "With a shovel?" Kowalczyk nodded. "Not the shovel. The reflection. Sunlight off the blade. Straight into his scope." Voss shook his head. "That's the dumbest thing I've heard all week. Kowalczyk, snipers are 500 meters out. You can't aim a reflection that far." Kowalczyk insisted it was possible, that he'd tested it, that the geometry worked. Voss cut him off. "Geometry," he said flatly, "doesn't stop bullets. Stick to your rifle." And that was the end of it, officially. But Kowalczyk didn't let it go. He kept the shovel blade polished, kept practicing the angle adjustments, kept studying the way sunlight moved across the Italian hills at different times of day. He noticed patterns. Morning light came low and golden, perfect for uphill reflections. Midday light was harsh and vertical, harder to aim but blinding if you got it right. Evening light was soft, less effective, but could still disorient if the target wasn't expecting it. He memorized the sun's arc, learned to estimate angles by feel, trained his hands to hold the blade steady even under stress. He didn't talk about it, didn't bring it up in briefings or bull sessions, but he carried that shovel everywhere, and when other soldiers asked why he kept the blade so clean, he just shrugged and said it dug better. Nobody questioned it. Nobody cared, which was exactly how Kowalczyk wanted it, because in the back of his mind, he knew doctrine was written by men who'd never had to improvise under fire, and the moment you stopped improvising, you stopped surviving. That moment came on May 14, 1943, during a morning patrol gone wrong. Kowalczyk's squad, 9 men total, led by Sergeant Voss, had been ordered to probe German defensive positions along the southern approach to Monte Cassino, map machine gun nests, identify sniper hides, radio back intelligence. It was supposed to be a recon mission, low contact, in and out before the sun climbed high enough to expose them. But at 0532 hours, while crossing a shallow ravine, the squad walked into an ambush. No machine guns, no mortars, just one sniper, invisible and precise, who killed a point man with a single shot to the chest. The squad scattered, diving into craters and behind rocks, and Sergeant Voss screamed for everyone to stay down, stay quiet, let the sniper reveal himself. But the sniper didn't reveal himself. He just waited, and at 0539 hours, he fired again, hitting the radio man through the shoulder, shattering bone and destroying the radio in one shot. At 0545 hours, he fired a third time, killing a rifleman who tried to low-crawl toward better cover. 3 shots, 3 hits, 0 misses, and now the squad was pinned, bleeding, with no way to call for help and no idea where the shooter was hiding. Kowalczyk lay in his crater, heart hammering, scanning the ridgeline with desperate focus. The sniper was up there somewhere, tucked into the ruins of a stone farmhouse or buried in a crevice between boulders, totally invisible from below. Standard tactics said, wait for artillery, wait for air support, wait for someone else to solve the problem. But they didn't have artillery on call, didn't have air support in range, didn't have time. The sun was climbing fast, and once it cleared the ridge behind them, the squad would be backlit, perfect targets, and the sniper would pick them off one by one until nobody was left. Kowalczyk's hands were shaking. His mouth was dry. He could hear Sergeant Voss shouting orders, telling everyone to stay low, hold position, don't move. But holding position meant dying slow. And Kowalczyk knew there was only one chance, one angle, one trick that might give them an opening. He reached back, unstrapped his entrenching tool, and pulled it free. The blade was clean, polished, mirror bright. He glanced up at the sun, now a hand span above the eastern hills, pouring gold light across the battlefield. He adjusted his grip, angled the blade, and began the most dangerous geometry problem of his life. The principle was simple. Light travels in straight lines, and reflections follow the law of equal angles. Angle of incidence equals angle of reflection, which meant a Kowalczyk could position the shovel blade so the sun's rays hit it at the correct angle. The reflected beam would shoot straight toward the sniper's position. The problem was aim. He couldn't see the sniper, couldn't see the scope, couldn't see anything except 200 meters of rocky hillside and shadow. But he could estimate. The sniper had fired 3 times from roughly the same position, which meant he wasn't moving much. Probably dug into a fixed hide with good cover and a narrow firing lane, based on the bullet trajectories, downward from elevation. Kowalczyk guessed the sniper was somewhere in a ruined farmhouse, upper floor, eastern-facing window. He tilted the shovel blade, catching the sun's light, and a brilliant streak shot across the hillside, 20 meters too low. He adjusted. The beam climbed, sweeping across stone and dirt. Still too low. He adjusted again, raising the blade angle, compensating for distance and elevation. The beam climbed higher, and then, suddenly, it locked on the farmhouse ruins, a searing line of reflected sunlight cutting straight through the shadowed window. Kowalczyk held it. His arms were already aching, the shovel blade heavy and awkward, but he held it, forcing the reflection steady, pouring concentrated sunlight into that narrow window like a burning spotlight. He couldn't see the sniper, couldn't see the scope, but he could imagine it. A German soldier. I pressed the scope, scanning the crater field for movement, and then, without warning, his entire sight picture exploding into white glare, so bright it hurt, so sudden it triggered an involuntary flinch. That was the theory, the hope, the gamble. Kowalczyk held the reflection for 5 seconds. 10, 15. His shoulders burned. His hands trembled. And then from the ridgeline he heard it. A sharp crack, a rifle shot, but not aimed at the squad. Aimed wild. High. The sniper had fired blind. Fired reflexively, because he couldn't see. Sergeant Voss heard it too. Heard the wildness in that shot, the panic, and his instincts kicked in immediately. "Grenadier!" he shouted. Window. Farmhouse. 200 meters. Fire for effect. The squad's grenadier, a thick-shouldered kid from Ohio named Briggs, rose to one knee, loaded an M7 rifle grenade, and fired. The grenade arced high, wobbling slightly, and detonated against the farmhouse wall in a spray of dust and shrapnel. Not a direct hit, but close enough. And in the confusion, with the sniper still blinded and disoriented, Voss gave the order. "Move! Now! Bounding overwatch, go!" The squad erupted from cover, half running, half crawling, leapfrogging from crater to crater, while Kowalczyk held a reflection, kept the beam steady, kept the sniper pinned in his own scope's glare. It was chaos and discipline all at once, a frantic scramble across open ground with bullets cracking overhead. But nobody got hit. Nobody died. Because the sniper couldn't see, couldn't aim, couldn't do anything except flinch and fire blind while Kowalczyk stood in that crater, arms screaming, shovel blade angled toward the sun, holding the light like a weapon. They reached the base of the ridgeline 30 seconds later, collapsing into cover behind a stone wall, gasping and shaking. Kowalczyk dropped the shovel, his arms numb, his vision swimming. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud and fast, pounding in his ears like a drum. Sergeant Voss crawled over, face streaked with dirt and sweat, and stared at him for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, What the hell did you just do? Kowalczyk swallowed hard, throat dry. Shovel edge, he managed, reflected sunlight into his scope. Voss blinked, looked at the shovel, looked at the farmhouse, looked back at Kowalczyk, and then, for the first time since the ambush started, he smiled. Not a big smile, not a laugh, just a small, grim twist of the lips that said, "You crazy bastard." It worked, and that was the beginning, not the end, because word of the shovel edge reflect shot spread fast through the 34th Infantry, whisper from foxhole to foxhole, squad to squad. And within days, soldiers across the Italian front were polishing their entrenching tools and practicing the angle. But the story didn't stay small. It couldn't, because 3 days after Kowalczyk's squad survived the ambush, another unit, Company G, 2nd Battalion, used the same technique to neutralize a German observation post that had been calling artillery strikes on American positions for a week. The observer, hidden in a church bell tower with binoculars and a radio, had a perfect view of the valley below and had been directing fire with deadly accuracy. Standard doctrine said, level the tower with air strikes or heavy artillery. But air strikes took time to coordinate, and artillery risked collateral damage to civilian structures. So a sergeant named Delacroix, who'd heard about Kowalczyk's trick, decided to try something different. At dawn, with the sun rising directly behind the American line, Delacroix and 2 privates positioned themselves in cover, angled their polished shovel blades toward the bell tower, and fired 3 beams of reflected sunlight straight into the observer's binoculars. The effect was immediate. The observer, blinded and panicked, stumbled backward, lost his footing, and fell 15 feet to the stone floor below, breaking his leg and abandoning his post. The artillery strikes stopped. The valley went quiet, and Company G credited their survival to a coal miner's son who'd figure out how to weaponize the sun. By June 1943, the technique had spread beyond the 34th Infantry. Engineers were teaching it to recon units. Recon units were teaching it to paratroopers. Paratroopers were teaching it to tank crews, who used polished metal plates to blind enemy anti-tank gunners during assaults. It became an informal, undocumented tactic, passed along through demonstration rather than manual, practice in downtime, used in crisis. And it worked. Not every time, not in every situation, but often enough that soldiers stopped laughing at the idea and started carrying polished tools. The German response was slow and confused. Sniper logs from the period, recovered after the war, include references to sudden optical interference, unexplained glare, and temporary blindness during engagements, but no clear understanding of what was causing it. Some snipers suspected Allied forces were using signal mirrors or heliographs. Others thought it was a new kind of incendiary round that produced a flash on impact. A few suspected deliberate blinding tactics, but had no proof, no consistent pattern. By the time German intelligence pieced together what was happening, that American infantry were using entrenching tools as improvised anti-optics weapons, the technique had already become so widespread that countering it required either avoiding daylight engagements entirely or redesigning scope optics with anti-glare coatings, neither of which was practical in the middle of a grinding ground war. The official military establishment, however, took longer to catch on. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, no field manual mentioned the technique. No training program taught it. No after-action report analyzed it in detail. It remained what military historians would later call a soldier innovation, a battlefield adaptation developed by enlisted men, tested under fire, and transmitted informally through the ranks without ever reaching the desks of planners and theorists. There were reasons for this. First, the technique was difficult to standardize. It required specific conditions: direct sunlight, a polished reflective surface, clear line of sight, and a target using optical equipment. Remove any one of those variables, and the tactic failed. Second, it was hard to measure. Unlike a rifle kill or a grenade hit, blinding an enemy didn't produce a body count or a destroyed position. It produced confusion, hesitation, missed shots, effects that were tactically valuable but statistically invisible. Third, and most importantly, it didn't fit doctrinal categories. It wasn't a weapon, wasn't a technique, wasn't a piece of equipment. It was a trick, and tricks, no matter how effective, didn't get written into manuals. But Emil Kowalczyk didn't care about manuals. He cared about keeping his squad alive. And for the next 11 months, from May 1943 to April 1944, that's exactly what he did. He fought through the rest of the Cassino campaign, survived the bloody push toward Rome, participated in the Anzio breakout, and saw action in a dozen smaller engagements where the shovel-edged trick saved lives, disrupted ambushes, and bought precious seconds of tactical advantage. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel during a mortar barrage, once by a ricochet that grazed his shoulder, but he refused evacuation both times, stayed with his unit, teaching newer replacements how to polish their tools, how to read the sun's angle, how to hold the beam steady under fire. By the time the 34th Infantry was rotated out of Italy in mid-1944, Kowalczyk had become something of a legend among the enlisted men. The quiet kid from Pennsylvania who turned a digging tool into a weapon and proven that survival wasn't about following orders blindly. It was about thinking, adapting, and turning the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. In late 1944, Kowalczyk was reassigned to European Theater of Operations, joining the push through France and into Germany. By then, the war had changed. The Italian mountains gave way to French hedgerows, then Belgian forests, then German industrial cities. The nature of combat shifted. Less static defense, more mobile warfare, fewer opportunities for long-range sniper duels. The shovel-edged trick became less useful, less relevant. But the mindset, the improvisation, the willingness to test unconventional ideas, the refusal to accept doctrine as gospel, stayed with Kowalczyk and the men who'd learned from him. They adapted the principle to new problems, using reflections to signal between separated units when radios failed, using polished metal to check around corners without exposing themselves, using sunlight glare to disorient enemy drivers during roadblock ambushes. The specific tactic evolved, but the underlying philosophy remained. In combat, everything is a tool. Everything has potential. And the soldier who sees that potential first is the soldier who survives. Kowalczyk survived the war. Came home in 1945, 24 years old, with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and a mind full of memories he never talked about. He returned to Pennsylvania, worked in a hardware store, married a schoolteacher named Rose, raised 3 kids, and lived a quiet, unremarkable life. He never wrote a memoir, never gave interviews, never sought recognition for the shovel-edge technique or the lives it saved. When asked about the war, he'd shrug and say it was a long time ago, that he'd done what everyone did, that there were no heroes, just men trying not to die. And for decades, that's where the story ended. Kowalczyk faded into obscurity, one of millions of veterans whose individual contributions were swallowed by the enormity of the war, whose innovations were forgotten because they didn't fit the narrative of grand strategy and famous battles. The shovel-edge trick, the reflect shot, the sun weapon that had saved dozens of lives and disrupted hundreds of enemy engagements, disappeared from history. No manual recorded it. No documentary featured it. No historian wrote about it. It became a ghost tactic, whispered in a few aging veteran circles, but otherwise lost. Until 1987. That year, a military historian named Dr. Catherine Aldridge was researching unconventional tactics used by Allied infantry during the Italian campaign for a book on soldier innovation and improvised warfare. She'd been interviewing veterans for months, collecting stories, cross-referencing unit records, when one former soldier, a man named Harold Briggs, the grenadier who'd been in Kowalczyk's squad, mentioned the incident at Monte Cassino. There was this guy, Briggs said, who figured out you could blind a sniper with a shovel. Sounds crazy, I know, but I saw it work. Saved our lives. Aldridge pressed for details. Briggs gave her Kowalczyk's name, described the ambush, explained the technique as best he could remember. Aldridge was skeptical. Shovel reflections? Blinding snipers at 200 meters? It sounded like wartime folklore, exaggerated over decades of retelling. But she tracked down more veterans from the 34th Infantry, found 3 others who'd witnessed the technique, found one who'd used it himself, and slowly, through interviews and pension records, she found Emil Kowalczyk, still alive, 72 years old, living in a small row house in Scranton, Pennsylvania. She called him, explained who she was, what she was researching, and asked if he'd be willing to talk. Kowalczyk was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know what you heard, but it wasn't a big deal. Just something I tried once." Aldrich flew to Pennsylvania, met him in person, brought photographs of the Monte Cassino ridgeline, maps of the ambush site, and testimonies from 3 veterans who credited him with saving their lives. Kowalczyk read the testimonies slowly, his hand shaking slightly, and when he finished, he looked up at Aldrich and said, "I didn't think anyone remembered." They talked for 3 hours. Kowalczyk described the technique in detail. The angle adjustments, the sunlight timing, the way the reflected beam behaved over distance. He explained the physics as he understood it, the trial and error, the moment in the crater when he gambled everything on a trick that shouldn't have worked but did. Aldrich recorded the interview, took notes, and later published a 15-page chapter in her book titled Improvised Anti-Optics Tactics in the Italian Campaign, dedicating it to Private First Class Emil Kowalczyk and the unnamed soldiers who turned entrenching tools into weapons of light. The book sold modestly. Military historians read it. A few veterans groups discussed it. But the shovel-edge technique never became famous, never made it into mainstream military training or popular documentaries. It remained an obscure footnote, a curiosity, a reminder that battlefield innovation often comes from the least expected places and is rarely recognized in official records. Kowalczyk himself never sought fame. When Aldrich's book came out, he read his chapter once, smiled faintly, and put on a shelf. He died in 1993, at age 78, surrounded by family, with no obituary mention of Monte Cassino or shovel blades or the sniper he'd blinded with the sun. His funeral was small, his grave marker simple, and the world moved on, forgetting once again that in May 1943, a coal miner's son had stood in a crater, held a polished shovel toward the sun, and proven that survival isn't about strength or firepower. It's about seeing angles no one else sees. But the story didn't die completely. In the decades that followed, the shovel-edge technique resurfaced periodically in military forums, survival blogs, and tactical training discussions. Modern soldiers, reading about Kowalczyk's innovation, began experimenting with updated versions, using polished metal mess kit lids, vehicle mirrors, even smartphone screens to create directed glare for signaling or disorientation. Special operations units explored the principle as part of non-lethal countermeasures training, teaching soldiers how to use improvised reflective surfaces to disrupt enemy optics during reconnaissance or hostage rescue scenarios. The physics hadn't changed. Light still traveled in straight lines. Reflection still followed predictable angles. And scopes, binoculars, and camera lenses were still vulnerable to intense, focused glare. What Kowalczyk had discovered in 1943, that the sun could be weaponized with nothing more than a polished edge and an understanding of geometry, remained tactically valid 80 years later. In 2018, a retired Army Ranger named Marcus De Leon wrote an article for a military tactics journal titled Lessons from Forgotten Innovations, The Kowalczyk Effect, in which he argued that modern military training had become so doctrine-dependent, so focused on technology and standardized procedures, that it actively discouraged the kind of improvisation Kowalczyk had embodied. "We train soldiers to use the tools we give them," De Leon wrote, "but we don't train them to see the battlefield as a toolkit." Kowalczyk didn't have anti-material rifles or thermal optics or drone surveillance. He had a shovel, sunlight, and a willingness to think differently, and that willingness saved lives. The article sparked debate in military education circles. Some argued that improvisation was too risky, too unpredictable, too dependent on individual creativity to be systematized. Others countered that the greatest tactical innovations, from trench periscopes to Bangalore torpedoes to shaped charges, had all begun as improvised solutions to immediate problems, later formalized into doctrine. The debate remained unresolved, as such debates often do, but the name Kowalczyk entered the lexicon of military innovation, a shorthand for the kind of lateral thinking that emerges when survival depends on seeing possibilities others miss. By 2020, the technique had found its way into civilian survival training as well. Wilderness guides taught it as a signaling method. Search and rescue teams used it to mark positions for helicopters. Protesters in Hong Kong used polished surfaces to reflect light into police surveillance cameras, temporarily blinding sensors. The principle direct focus light as a tool for disruption had transcended its military origins and become a universal tactic, applicable anywhere someone needed to see, signal, or blind. And in every case, whether acknowledged or not, the lineage traced back to a crater on a hillside in Italy, where a 22-year-old private with a polished shovel had turned the sun into a weapon. The legacy of Emil Kowalczyk isn't found in statues or textbooks. It's found in the countless small moments, scattered across decades and continents, where someone facing an impossible problem refused to accept the tools they were given and instead looked around, saw potential in the ordinary, and improvised a solution. It's in the soldier who uses a belt buckle to signal an aircraft, in the engineer who redirects sunlight with a car mirror to illuminate a dark workspace, in the hiker who reflects sun off a water bottle to alert distant rescuers. These aren't grand innovations. They don't change the course of wars or reshape industries, but they save lives. They solve problems. They remind us that intelligence isn't just knowledge. It's the ability to see connections, test ideas, and adapt under pressure. And that ability, more than any weapon or technology, is what keeps people alive when everything else fails. In the end, the story of the shovel-edge reflect shot isn't really about a technique. It's about a mindset. It's about the refusal to be limited by what you're supposed to do, the courage to test what you think might work, and the humility to recognize that the most powerful innovations often come from the most unexpected places. Emil Kowalczyk didn't set out to change military doctrine or invent a new weapon. He just wanted to keep his squad alive. And in doing so, he demonstrated a truth that every generation has to relearn, that survival belongs to those who see the battlefield not as a fixed set of rules, but as a shifting puzzle where every element, even the sun itself, can become a tool in the right hands. The morning light that saved Kowalczyk's squad on May 14, 1943, was the same light that had risen over battlefields for millennia, indifferent and constant. But on that day, in that moment, one man saw it differently. Saw it not as illumination, but as a weapon, not as a passive element, but as an ally. And in that shift of perception, in that willingness to test an idea that sounded absurd and improvise under fire, Emil Kowalczyk joined a long, invisible line of soldiers, engineers, medics, and ordinary people who've changed the course of history, not with grand gestures, but with small, stubborn acts of creative defiance. They didn't wait for permission, didn't wait for doctrine. They saw a problem, imagined a solution, and made it work. And every life saved by their ingenuity is a testament to the power of thinking differently when it matters most. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him. And if you want more stories of forgotten heroes and battlefield innovation, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below.